I'd like to introduce our next speaker. I got to hear Jay for the first time. I've read his book, Unwanted. I thought when I picked up the book first that it was a book written about me, but that probably doubly funny when you hear his presentation, though. But he is a pastor. He's a physiotherapist or psychotherapist, and has a very, very interesting and very challenging topic that I think most of us have probably seen or had to deal with. How brokenness reveals our way to healing. Jay, would you come on up? Jay Stringer. Give him a warm round of applause.
Good morning. So as Jim said, my name is Jay, but what you likely didn't know is that my middle name is actually Elmer. Some chuckles. This was middle school for me. Wascally Wabbit and Elmer's Glue. So I have both my grandfather's names. Jay was my dad's father's name, and he died about 2 years before I was born. And then Elmer died when I was in seminary. And I'm not sure if you've ever been to a funeral like this, but the sadness that I felt at Elmer's funeral was not so much about his passing, but the reality that I never really knew him in his life. And so a couple years later, my aging grandmother, Dorothy, my dad's mom, started to have some health complications, which required a move basically from Chattanooga, Tennessee, to a town called Paulsbo, Washington. Ferry ride. Yeah, some Paulsbo people. It's basically a Viking village that looks like the Truman Show, if you've never been there. So I realized that if I'm going to know anything significant about the life of a living grandparent, now was going to be the time to do it. The only problem, however, was that Dorothy could be a cold steel door when it came to sharing stories or emotions. I was 8 years old, middle of January, Christmas had just passed, my parents were out on a date, phone rings, I pick it up, and my grandma says, "Is your father there?" I say, "No, he's not, can I take a message?" And Dorothy says, "No, that's all right. Well, actually, if you could just let your father know I was quite disappointed by what your family gave me for Christmas this year." "Sure, Grandma, I'll deliver that message to your son." So this was the challenge in front of me. So around her 90th birthday in Paulsbo, Washington, I decided to take her out to her birthday. In preparation for that, I went to an antique store in Seattle, Washington, and I found 3 skeleton keys from the era of my grandmother's birth year. Bought this really beautiful box, took her out to this cafe, sat her down, and said, "Grandma, these 3 keys symbolize 3 lunches that I want to take you out to learn more about your life." I thought this was the best grandson gift of all time. My grandmother knew a Trojan horse when she saw one, and looked completely horrified. She looked down, 5 seconds passed, 10 seconds passed. She looked down at the box and then shoved it back across the table at me and said, "Jay, there are some doors you just don't open. There are some stories you just don't tell." About 2 minutes later, my grandmother asked me to take her back to her assisted living home. And this was our last meaningful conversation. A couple years ago, my parents were going through her medical records just to try and figure out who was this woman. And my dad always grew up believing that he was the firstborn son to Dorothy. In basically a sheet of paper attached to his birth certificate, there was a question that was asked if Dorothy had had any previous births before John. That box was checked yes. As much as we've been able to piece together since her death, she was likely raped by a family member sometime around the age of 14 and then shipped off to Louisiana. What I want to point out here is that my grandmother's cold, locked door of emotion was not random. It was a direct reflection of the parts of her story that she had never told. The story that she couldn't tell at 14 imprisoned her for over 80 years. And I've often wondered quite a bit since that day how my life, how my father's life would have been different had my grandmother had a community, a church, to talk about those devastating stories. When we don't tell our story, our self-destructive choices will do it for us. This morning, I want to share with you about the stories that we don't want to tell. The simple assumption is that every one of us in this room has a story or a collection of stories that we wish we could efface from our lives. That could be an unwanted sexual behavior, like a lifelong struggle with pornography. Maybe it was an affair that you had during a low point in your marriage. But it could also be a trauma from long ago, one that you have concluded is just too unspeakable to name. And you know you're getting really close to these stories when the severe voice of shame warns you like a police officer to remain silent. But I want to propose a counterintuitive, if not radical, notion to you this morning. What if your untold stories, like my grandmother's, actually contain the keys to the freedom that you have been waiting your whole life to find? And therefore, one of the greatest gifts that you could give yourself and your kids is to suspend the belief that you know what your broken story reveals about you. Shame is a merciless storyteller, and we would do well to question its narration in our life. I am a psychotherapist. I spend my days working with men and women struggling with unwanted sexual behavior, which I just define as basically pornography, infidelity, buying sex, hookups. Essentially, it's any dimension of someone's sexual life that at the end of the day, they wish they could eliminate. And what we know from the statistics is that sexual brokenness is everywhere we look. So 1/3 of all marriages in this room will be impacted by infidelity. Approximately 30% of all porn users are now women. Porn sites receive more monthly traffic than Netflix, Amazon, and Twitter combined. 57% of our pastors and 64% of our youth pastors struggle or have struggled with pornography. Additionally, this data point came out last year. The world on one website alone watched 4.6 billion hours of porn. One website. That's equal to over 5,000 centuries. But here's the dilemma. The Christian engagement of these topics is terrible. It's primarily what I refer to as lust management. And you know this all too well. This is the bounce your eyes from attractive people, slap a rubber band around your wrist. If you continue to struggle, clearly get some internet monitoring on your computer. And then if you're profoundly broken, you need some accountability, right? This is lust management in action. But the reality, as one of my friends put to me recently, he said, Jay, when I have been having the same conversation with my accountability partner for 15 years, something isn't working, right? And so I realized that unless we radically change this conversation, and I mean radically, we are going to continue to consign another generation and many marriages to a lifetime of futility with this issue. And something in me just rose up and said, hell no, not on my watch. And so what I decided to do was to conduct some research on over 4,000 men and women about the key drivers behind and beneath unwanted sexual behavior. I figured that if we could just ask people to tell us their story, not just the story of their sexual brokenness, then we could find insights from the data that we could then return back to them to aid their freedom. And that is exactly what happened. I uncovered a mountain of untold stories longing to be freed. And so what I can tell you from the outset is there is nothing random about your unique form of sexual brokenness. Even the specifics of what you put into Google, what you put into search bars, could be shaped and predicted based on the parts of your story that remained unaddressed. So to me, this implication is huge. It means that your sexual brokenness, the sexual brokenness of someone you love, can be a roadmap to healing, not a life sentence to sexual shame or addiction. Sexual brokenness is a roadmap to healing. So I want to tell you just a little bit about my life and why I am here. And I'm going to start in seminary. So when I was in seminary, I lived with a bunch of guys, and one of these guys worked the closing shift at our local Starbucks. Does anyone know what privilege you get if you work that shift? I think I heard it over here. Donuts? Yeah. Yes, free dayold pastries. So a couple mornings a week, my friend Dave would walk into our house with these brown paper sacks full of baked goods. And then we would all kind of huddle around and watch him load up our kitchen counters, and they would kind of morph into the stadium of blueberry and pumpkin scones, chocolate chip cookies, donuts, cake pops, and to me, the most alluring of all, the apple fritter. And I'm not sure if you've ever had moments like this, but you walk into your house after a very long day, and then you can almost hear these sweets begin to whisper to you. And they say, Jay, you've had a really, really hard day. Come here. And so I'd walk over, and then they would say, put me in the microwave. 16 seconds, that'll do it. And so I listened, and I put it in the microwave for 16 seconds and pulled it out. And if you've ever done that, you know just the unmistakable sound of sizzling dough. And then I would pour white chocolate sauce all over the top, and I would have myself an evening. The next day, however, I would wake up, and unsurprisingly, I would despise myself. And then I would go into seminary classes feeling like a hypocrite, and fearing that people would see an appetite and a belly that I had condemned. And so then I would hide out in the back of the library, hide out in coffee shops, then get home really late in the evening after I knew my housemates might be in bed. And then, and here's the madness of all of our unwanted behaviors, I would do the very thing that had just caused me misery throughout the day. I would eat another apple fritter with a cake pop and white chocolate sauce. But this time it wasn't enough to just feel like crap. I needed something to begin to assuage some of the guilt and shame that I was experiencing. And this quickly became the function of pornography in my life. It definitely gave me a sense of relief, but far more, it poured gasoline on the fire of my self-hatred. Unfortunately for me, however, this kind of eating episodes, if it were a Netflix show, there would be a flashback to this boy. I was an obese 8th grader in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., child of a pastor about to fail algebra. And as you all know, middle school is a prototype of hell. And so what makes middle school even worse than having a middle name of Elmer and being obese is that I grew up in the era of the Pillsbury Doughboy commercials. Can I hear the sound? Woo-hoo. Yeah. So I would get to the bus stop, and my bus stop peers would put their fingers into my belly, and then make the woohoo. And so then what would happen after a day of bullying and abuse is that I would get back home, and again, I would wait for everyone to go to bed, and then I would go down to the kitchen, and I would start eating donuts and brownies, the Hostess cream pies, oatmeal cream pie. It's the oatmeal cream pie. That's what I was looking for. And then I would eat all this, feel like crap, and then I would go take a shower before bed, and then I'd get out of the shower, and I would just look at my belly, and I would hate myself. And so I'd grab it and then shake it and flap it like a doormat. And you know where the story goes from here. Where does a middle schooler go when he's struggling with self-hatred? To find relief, but also more judgment. Sexual brokenness. The story that I couldn't tell from middle school eventually grew into a life story that I was too ashamed to tell. And here's the deal. The more that we feel ashamed, the more shame you experience, the more that you will pursue behaviors that provide you with irrefutable evidence that you are broken beyond repair. Contrary to popular wisdom, we are not looking for love in all the wrong places. We're not bored. We're not self-medicating. We're not lusting. We are looking for behaviors that confirm how cursed and how stuck we believe we are. But just as my unwanted sexual behaviors in seminary were inviting me to heal and to address the heartache of this boy, so is your sexual brokenness a clarion call to heal the underlying heartaches in your story. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. So how does this relate to you all as being a business leader? Well, what I have come to learn about you all in my work with you over the last 10 years is that you all are some of the most astoundingly gifted and yet profoundly lonely men and women that I have ever had the privilege to meet. The amount of complexity, the amount of confusion, transference, salary that you all experience is immense. And without good care, your life can quickly morph into a petri dish for unwanted behaviors of all kinds. And just in case you didn't think your jobs were difficult enough, I've got some statistics for you. 50 to 60% of executives fail within the first 18 months of being appointed. Additionally, 38% of business leaders did not expect the loneliness that they experienced in their positions. As you all know, you differentiate yourself through individualism, but most of you profoundly underestimate how much you need people once you get to the top. And what we know clinically is that the more of a failure you feel like and the more isolated you are, the more behaviors that you will pursue that promise a sense of relief for you, but end up compounding the original heartache and shame. So what can we do? I'm going to propose 3 things this morning. We face the problem, we face the fantasy, and third, we face the pain. So mental health is a commitment to reality at all costs. That's an M. Scott Peck quote. You cannot become more spiritually healthy than you are emotionally healthy. The issue that I run into so many times with Christians is that they try to pray their behaviors away, rather than seeing problems as very fertile territory for growth to emerge. I want to read you a quote from a guy named Robert McKee, who works with a lot of corporations, but he's also a screenwriting coach, has done many great films. And here's what he says. When people ask me to help turn their presentations into stories, I begin by asking questions. I kind of psychoanalyze their companies, and amazing dramas pour out. But most companies and executives sweep the dirty laundry, the difficulties, the antagonists, and the struggle under the carpet. They prefer to present a rosy and boring picture to the world. But as the storyteller, you want to position the problems in the foreground and then show how you overcome them. Another way of saying this is that most executives do not tell the truth, right? We prefer to present a rosy picture to the world. But here's the dilemma, not only within the companies that you run, but also with your personal life. If you are not putting the problems into the foreground and then working to overcome them, you are not going to become healthy. So I want to tell you about 2 people who have allowed their brokenness to actually reveal the way to healing. First man's name is Kyle. Kyle arrived in my office after an international business trip, ended in him doing something that he swore he would never do. He paid for a massage that he knew would end in an orgasm. So he came in to do an intensive with me, and what he told me was that his marriage, like many in this room today, had become increasingly sexless, save for a few experiences of what he referred to as charity sex from his wife. I asked him what he attributed this to, and he said about 5 years ago, he had made a sexual advance towards his wife. She rebuffed him, and he was so angry, he couldn't sleep, went downstairs and started watching porn. About an hour later, his wife realized that he wasn't in the bedroom, came downstairs and watched him watching porn. And she basically said, Kyle, until you figure this sick crap out, we're not having sex again. And so their life went on as it normally did. They went to movies, attended fundraisers, even had family reunions where they were discussing family legacy planning. But emotionally, they were drifting further and further apart. And it was in this season that he bought that massage. Additionally, he had just been promoted within his company. His bosses believed that past accomplishments were easily going to translate into future success. And if you all have ever been in those situations, you know that your past success with another business does not easily translate into success in the future. So lots of futility, lots of heartache, felt like he was failing his marriage, he was failing in his work, and could not get over the difficulty. Next person I want you to meet is Lauren. And Lauren is 26 years old, and she came to see me basically due to some depression, and really just the heartache of being a 26-year-old. She had applied for a lot of MBAs. Stanford was her first choice, and like most people who apply for Stanford, she didn't get in. She did get into Booth and Columbia, but her family wasn't quite ready to move to Chicago or New York. And so she basically just felt like she had no idea what to do next. Her husband, meanwhile, was on the fast track to becoming a partner in his law firm. And basically the problem that she presented to me is that the moment that he goes off to work, she feels this automatic arousal come over her, and then she starts watching porn. So these are the two presenting problems. And as you can see, both Kyle and Lauren are experiencing futility and a lack of purpose in very different ways. And here's what my data showed about people who are struggling with a lack of purpose in their lives. They were 7 times more likely to increase their involvement in porn. As you can see, the use of pornography can often become a squatter in people's lives when they don't know who they are and they don't know where they're going in life. Secondly, we need to face the fantasy. Fantasies are our greatest teachers. And so when people like Kyle and Lauren come to see me, one of the questions that I ask them is to tell me some of the specifics of what they search for on the internet. And judging by their faces and some of your faces this morning, this is probably the reason why most people avoid therapy. So I basically asked Kyle to tell me this, and he's like, that's really strange to talk about. Why is that even important? And what I told him is that all of us have an arousal template, which is a constellation of images, thoughts, sensations, times of day, relational archetypes that we all find arousing. And what my data showed is that every one of those specifics actually has something really important to tell us. So let's get into Kyle's arousal template. Well, for Kyle, what he ended up telling me is that he wanted to see any woman, most commonly a female mother figure, who had amazing eyes. And he said that I could basically scroll through pornography sites for hours just trying to lock eyes with the right woman in the porn film. And additionally, he said whenever he's in his home city, he's found himself driving through prostitution corridors just trying to lock eyes with someone on the streets. And one of the fascinating things that my research found is, let's say that that was your fantasy. You wanted to see an older woman, a mother figure, someone who seemed to have power. This was your story. You had an emotionally confining parent as a child. You had experiences of childhood sexual abuse. And third, a history of depression. Or let's say you preferred to see younger women, teenagers, college students, a race that suggested to you some level of subservience. This was your story. A strict father, a lack of purpose, and very high levels of shame. So as you can see, the fantasies that we pursue are not random. And so one of the reasons why porn becomes appealing, particularly to men, is that it gives them an arena to reestablish power in their life. You could be experiencing relational difficulty, workplace difficulty, but in porn, you get exactly what you want when you want it. So for Lauren, when I asked her, she basically recalled something in college where she was hired as a nanny, and while she was nannying this child, she put the 6-month-old down to sleep, and then started roaming around the family's house and ended up in the master bedroom and just started looking through different drawers, bedside tables. What she didn't realize is that the family actually had a nanny cam, and saw her. And what she said is, I was so relieved that all they thought I was trying to do was steal jewelry. Because the reality is that she was scanning throughout the house to try and find sex toys or to try and find their pornography stash. And she said, I have no idea why I do it, but whenever I go to different people's houses, that's always the thing that I'm trying to find underneath kitchen sinks. If I spend the night house sit for someone, I'm always looking through their drawers. So that was Lauren's fantasy. So why do we do this work? Sure, some of you still are not fully convinced that getting into your fantasy life is important. I'm going to get through this. This is all, I meant to say that I have a book called Unwanted. It's in the back. All these slides are in here as well. Psalm 139 basically says that God knows our thoughts. In Psalm 139, it says, God, investigate my life. Get all the facts firsthand. I am an open book to you. And so that's the reality of what the gospel is all about, is that when we come to Jesus, we give Jesus all of our thoughts. We say, investigate me. If there's anything that doesn't lead to the life everlasting, I want you to know it. And by the end of the psalm, it says, your thoughts, how rare, how beautiful. God, I will never comprehend them. That's what the gospel is all about. You reveal everything that is broken within you, and still somehow the God of the universe has rare and precious thoughts about you. So third and finally, we need to face the pain. Unwanted sexual behaviors are not random. So in therapy, I began to invite Kyle and Lauren to see their sexual brokenness as a roadmap to healing rather than a life sentence to a terminal illness. And to do that, I will ask my clients two key questions. The first is to tell me about a first exposure to pornography or their first sexual experience. And what we find is that most people actually don't discover porn or choose their first sexual experience. It was introduced to them, usually by a peer or someone much older than them that had more sexual knowledge. Another way of saying that is it's a form of sexual abuse. And the second question is to basically tell me about a formative trauma that they have been through between the ages of 5 and 15. And what we've learned about trauma in the last, especially decade, is that trauma is not just some event that happened to us long ago. It is the ongoing imprint of that story on us today. So a lot of you in this room might be done with your past. All I can tell you is that your past is not done with you. It's going to get your attention in the only way that it knows how. Kyle. Kyle's first sexual experience actually came with a babysitter. He was 11 years old. His parents were out on an anniversary weekend. The babysitter put his little brother to sleep, and then she started putting him down to sleep, sang over him, massaged his back, and all he told me from that first night is that it was some of the most tender touch that he had ever experienced in his life. The second night, she asked him in a very flirtatious way if he wanted to return the favor. And that was his first sexual experience. And as he talked, it was very apparent that he had known a life of a lot of abandonment. And so I asked him about that. I said, what's your story been like up until that moment? And he said that the two scenes that flashed to his mind were, one, he was in a crib, probably about 3 years old, reaching out, trying to just cry out for his mom, his dad, to come into his room, and no one came. The second memory that he had in his life was basically being about 6, 7 years old. He has the flu, and he watches his parents pull out of the driveway to head to work, and he's crying next to a nanny. The next scene that he brought me was basically being about a middle schooler, and his parents gave him a brand new Schwinn bicycle. And he said, Jay, I loved that bicycle. So I said, tell me about it. And what he said is, I used to cruise around the streets of my neighborhood for hours, just trying to lock eyes with a middle school student or a friend's mom. For Lauren, the story that she brought me had to do with spending the summers with her grandparents. In the midst of being there over the summer, basically her grandfather was a very authoritarian type, set up a lot of chores for them to do. And so basically Lauren's grandfather and grandmother would head out for the day to run errands, and then would basically leave the kids to take care of chores. So Lauren's brothers would do the outdoor chores, they would mow the lawn, rake the leaves, but she was assigned to clean basically the guest quarters of the house, the guest bedroom, the guest bathroom, and her grandfather was very particular about his glass cleaner. So he basically said, Lauren, this is the way that I want you to scrub the kitchen sinks. This is the way that I want you to clean the bathrooms. And so whenever she would go to clean the guest bathroom and get his glass cleaner, well, underneath the kitchen sink, next to the glass cleaner, was actually his collection of Penthouse and Playboy magazines. As you can see, Lauren didn't discover pornography. Her grandfather set her up to find it. So as you can see, trying to manage unwanted sexual behavior through just lust management, pursuing purity, and yes, even being a godly man or a woman almost never works because the underlying heartaches of people's stories was never addressed. So healing, and this is what my research found as well, 24%, or people who struggled with pornography to the greatest extent had sexual abuse scores that were nearly 24% higher than those who did not view pornography at all. And as you can do, some of you, I could tell, were already connecting the dots, right? These things are not random. So for Kyle, some of the dots that he needed to connect were the ways that he would try and lock eyes with a woman in pornography with the ways that he tried to lock eyes with people in middle school growing up. He also began to connect the dots between illicit massages as an adult was part of what was drawing him back to understand where that story came from with his babysitter. And for Lauren, the dots that she began to connect is that need to be sexual and look at porn whenever someone would leave the house, and searching through different people's restrooms and their master bedrooms was something that she learned to do in her grandparents' house. So I want to be clear that I'm not asking you all to draw hard and fast conclusions right now between your unwanted behaviors and your life story. I totally believe that those connections are there, and I've got a lot of resources if you're interested in finding out more. But maybe as I talked this morning, certain scenes from your life were coming to mind. And those are the stories that I want you to be most curious about. I can only underscore that when Kyle and Lauren first came in to see me, none of these connections had ever occurred to them, which makes me wonder how many of you could tell me the formative stories that formed and sustained your sexual brokenness. Throughout the book of Genesis, those who find themselves in a difficult place are met by the curiosity and the kindness of God, and I have to believe it's going to be that way in our lives as well. So for Adam, after he's just eaten of the tree that he was commanded not to eat from, God doesn't say, basically, bounce your eyes from that next apple, right? He says, where are you? To Jacob, what is your name? And to Hagar, who has just been immensely traumatized by the first family of the faith, two of the best questions you could ever ask someone. Where do you come from and where are you going? The presence of God in our lives calls forth the stories that we don't want to tell, because he knows that in our honest wrestling with our story, we are going to understand just how committed God is to our redemption. So, the next time that you find yourself in a broken story, may you recognize that the God of the universe is not ashamed of you. Instead, his face is turned toward you with kindness. And his arrival is not to reproof you, but to get down on his knees, to offer you his body, his blood, to lock eyes with you in the midst of a story that you can only see through the lens of failure. And it's only here that you begin to understand that this God is not inviting you to lock up the doors of desire within you, but instead, inexplicably, he throws you the keys to his entire kingdom. And he invites you to unlock all the beauty, all the wildness that you can find on this earth. My friends, we simply have no idea the redemption that God has for us within the locked stories of our lives. Thank you.
Would you bow your head with me as we kind of pray and think through what we heard and saw this morning? I hope you all agree that pretty impactful morning. I hope that there's something that each of us will take away today that will draw us closer to the Lord. Father, I just thank you for this time, and Russ brought us up to date on what you're doing through the Barnabas Group coaching program and offered us opportunities to get involved, to come alongside these ministries. I pray, Lord, that there's people here that are going to take that challenge in 2020 and get involved in that program, and that they will be blessed as they bless these ministries. Then Steve and Corby came up and broke our hearts with the sadness that they deal with every day in Guatemala and these young children. How can we help? Who here might go with them down and take a look at what's going on and just love on these kids and show these kids that there's people that care? Who might go with them? Then Bob challenged us, as he always does. Are we ready for that next big event? What's the Gantt chart for our life, Lord, and our growth as a Christ follower? Then Ian Stevenson came and shared his heart for our local cities and what he's done through Trellis in Costa Mesa. God, I know you want unity. How can you use us in establishing unity in our cities? Then Brent came and shared what God has done through him and Promise Child over the past 16 years. I'm struck by his quote that the gospel is only good news if it gets there in time. That's something that will stick with me. Then Paul shared his vision for on Mission 3 and how he wants to activate people and families to serve on a regular basis right in their own neighborhoods, in their communities, places that we often overlook and people we walk by and don't even think about sharing with. And finally, Jay challenged us. He explained how our brokenness reveals our way to healing. I pray that the people in this audience that need that message or know friends who know family, and maybe it's themselves, that they will take away things from this that will help them. Father, just thank you for this morning. I pray that you would give everyone safe travels home. And once again, I would pray that something happened today that will change our life and draw us closer to you. We lift this up to you in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. You guys have a great rest of the day, and thank you very much for Barnabas Group. I hope that you decide to join.